Hey everyone, welcome back to The Explainer. We've got an absolutely massive and highly consequential topic to unpack today. We're going to be looking at the architecture of transnational repression, and we are specifically zeroing in on how the Indian state has dramatically expanded its reach far beyond its own borders over the last 10 to 12 years. Our core source material for this deep dive is a really fascinating forensic autopsy titled The Global Chilling Effect. This report meticulously documents a major shift in both policy and action, and it analyzes this specific period corresponding with the arrival and consolidation of the Modi BJP government over the past decade. We are going to look closely at the actual mechanics of how a nation exerts control, how it silences dissent, and how it manages narratives globally, way outside its own territorial jurisdiction. This isn't just about abstract geopolitics or high-level diplomacy. The researchers here are pointing to the very tangible, very real mechanics of global control.
Okay, let's start right here with this quote. Transnational repression is the externalization of domestic coercion. This is basically the foundational concept of the source material we're looking at today. Because when we normally think about state coercion, we usually picture a government operating strictly within its own borders, right? Using its own police force or its own courts to manage its own citizens. But what happens when the exact people a state wants to coerce, whether that's activists, journalists, separatists, or just outspoken critics, what happens when they move away? Say they relocate to Canada, the United States, or the UK. Well, this concept argues that the coercion doesn't just stop. It doesn't magically disappear. It simply externalizes. The borders of the host country no longer act as a shield for these individuals. The repressing state essentially just packs up its domestic toolkit and exports the whole shebang globally.
So here is our roadmap for the Explainer today. We've got 4 parts. 1, defining repression. 2, the kinetic architecture. 3, proxy coercion. And 4, geopolitical reality.
All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, defining repression and what the source calls the architecture of deniability.
So what exactly are we talking about here? Transnational repression occurs when a state attempts to monitor, intimidate, silence, punish, or even physically harm people living outside its borders. And the key trigger for this state action is usually their political speech, their religious identity, their ethnic affiliation, or their advocacy work. Now, it's called repression because it specifically targets protected dissent, and it's transnational because the victim is literally standing in an entirely different country, very often a Western democracy that has its own constitution and its own strict civil rights protections. The repressing state is essentially reaching across the globe to tell these dissidents, hey, your new passport doesn't protect you.
To pull this off, the source details a highly organized 5-part toolkit. Number 1 is kinetic action, which means direct physical violence or assassination. Number 2 is proxy violence. This is where you use organized criminal networks or contract killers to do the dirty work. Number 3 is family leverage, intimidating relatives who are still back in the home country. Number 4 is administrative exile, canceling visas, revoking statuses, or freezing assets. And finally, number 5 is narrative containment, actively branding dissidents as terrorists in their host countries. Now, you might be wondering, why use all these different, distinct tools? Well, it's all about deniability. Think about it. The diplomat gathering intel is completely separate from the visa officer canceling a travel document, who is completely separate from the gunman in the street. They all operate in these tight legal silos to maintain state deniability. But as the source heavily notes, for the victim actually experiencing this, it feels like one massive cohesive system closing in on them from all sides.
Moving on to Section 2, the kinetic architecture. We are looking at the shift from doctrine to action.
The source material maps out a really rapid, staggering escalation over the last decade. It specifically pinpoints 2019 as a major doctrinal turning point. Following the Pulwama attack, the Indian government's public posture completely shifted. The reports indicate a definitive move away from defensive counterterrorism toward a bold claim of extraterritorial reach, effectively stating that hostile actors living abroad were no longer beyond their grasp. Then, from 2020 to 2022, Pakistan reportedly became the proving ground for this. According to investigative reports, this is where the operational grammar was really rehearsed, figuring out how to use local criminal proxies and disposable shooters to eliminate targets while giving the state plausible deniability. Once that grammar was established, the reporting traces a massive leap directly to North America in 2023. We see the assassination of Canadian citizen Hardeep Singh Nijjar in British Columbia and the foiled murder for hire plot against U.S. citizen Gurpawant Singh Pannoon in New York. And all of this culminates in 2026 with the guilty plea of Nikhil Gupta right in a Manhattan courtroom.
Now, when we are unpacking a topic this serious and this globally sensitive, the source material meticulously categorizes the evidence into proved findings versus documented allegations, and we absolutely need to keep that legal distinction clear. So, it is a proved finding, completely backed by a sworn admission in U.S. federal court, that Nikhil Gupta transferred $15,000 as a down payment for the murder of Penoon, acting at the direction of an individual identified as an Indian government employee. It is also a proved finding that Canada's official Hague Commission explicitly cited India for significant foreign interference. However, the Canadian prosecution of the 4 men arrested for the Najjar assassination, that remains a documented allegation right now, as it is currently working its way through the justice system. Furthermore, deep investigative reporting by Bloomberg has alleged that these operations were likely sanctioned by senior figures in New Delhi. Again, that remains an extremely serious but unadjudicated documented allegation. It is absolutely vital we keep these legal boundaries clear as we map this whole thing out.
Which brings us to a really foundational finding from the Canadian government. The Hague Commission, which was an official public inquiry into foreign interference, concluded that India does not appear to differentiate between lawful political advocacy and violent extremism, specifically when it comes to the Khalistan movement. The source material argues that this failure to differentiate is actually the very engine of the entire global chilling effect. Because think about it. If a state views a civil rights lawyer writing a peaceful op-ed or community leader passing a local resolution at a gurdwara as functionally identical to an armed insurgent, well then the state is going to deploy the exact same extreme counterterrorism tools against all of them.
Okay, let's pivot to Section 3, Administrative and Proxy Coercion. This is what the researchers call the invisible architecture.
I want you to consider this observation straight from our source material. Physical distance protects the activist's body. It does not protect the people the activist loves. That just hits hard, doesn't it? It gets right to the deeply psychological and frankly insidious nature of transnational repression. Because you might be perfectly safe sitting in California or Toronto. Your physical rights might be completely protected by the First Amendment or the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But if your elderly parents, your siblings, or your ancestral lands are still back in Punjab, you are inherently, constantly vulnerable.
This is what they call coercion by proxy, and it is described as the quietest but arguably the most brutally efficient tool in the state's entire arsenal. Why? Because it leaves almost no paper trail. We are talking about retaliatory police visits to an uncle's house in Punjab simply because an activist attended a protest rally in London. We're talking about the sudden freezing of a family's bank accounts without any formal charges ever being filed. We're talking about quietly placing siblings on exit control lists, which turns a routine trip to the airport into an absolute nightmare. According to the source, the genius of this strategy is that it relies entirely on indirection. The state rarely issues a formal written gag order. Instead, it uses geographic leverage as a kind of hostage-taking. So every single time an activist sits down to write an article or organize a peaceful rally, they are literally forced to weigh their public speech against the private safety and existence of their family.
57. Just keep that number in your head for a second. Here's why that number 57 is so important. It represents a massive, sudden data point regarding Overseas Citizen of India, or OCI cards. Now, for the diaspora, an OCI card isn't just a piece of plastic. It is practically a document of belonging. It allows visa-free travel to go back and visit aging parents or ancestral homes. For a full decade, from 2014 to 2023, the data shows that roughly 122 of these cards were canceled under a really vague public interest clause. That averages out to about 12 a year. But in 2024 alone, that number spiked to 57 in a single year. Think about that. Almost half of the entire preceding decade's total was compressed into just 12 months. The researchers point out that this sudden acceleration of administrative exile aligns perfectly, almost identically, with the kinetic escalations, the assassinations, and the plots that we discussed earlier. It strongly suggests a massive, coordinated expansion of the state's reach.
To truly wrap our heads around this, we have to look at the actual individuals losing these crucial documents of belonging. The source material highlights several really prominent cases to put some faces to the data. There's Atish Tasir, a well-known journalist whose OCI was abruptly revoked shortly after he wrote a highly critical 2019 cover story profiling Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Then you have Rafael Sadr, a Reuters reporter who found his OCI completely canceled right after investigating Indian firms that were linked to global hacking-for-hire operations. And Natasha Kaul, a British Kashmiri academic. She was actually invited to speak at a conference by a state minister, but when she landed, she was detained at the airport, denied entry, and later stripped of her OCI status entirely over what the government termed inimical writings. So what do all these people have in common? According to the reports we're examining, they wrote, they reported, or they spoke in ways the state found objectionable. A passport officer literally just checks a box on a form, and suddenly an individual is permanently exiled from their cultural homeland.
All right, let's head into our final section. Section 4, Geopolitical Reality and the Contest for Vocabulary.
Let's look at how these foreign conflicts are actually fought out in our domestic legislatures, using California's SB 509 from 2025 as a perfect case study. This was a bill specifically designed to train local police to recognize the tactics of transnational repression. It passed the California Assembly and Senate completely unanimously. We're talking 59-0 and 40-0. Yet despite that, it was ultimately vetoed by Governor Gavin Newsom. The source attributes this stunning reversal to an incredibly intense lobbying battle between domestic advocacy groups. On one side, Sikh civil rights groups like the Sikh Coalition strongly supported the bill, calling it essential protection for their communities. On the other side, Hindu American advocacy groups like HAF and Kohana aggressively opposed it. They argued the bill would unfairly target and stigmatize Hindu Americans, and they even went so far as to liken the bill's supporters to extremists. Now keep in mind, these are all American nonprofits exercising their First Amendment rights. But the source points out a profound, really fascinating convergence here. They argue that domestic advocacy groups were successfully using rhetoric that perfectly mirrored a foreign government's stance, effectively blurring the lines between civil rights advocacy and extremism, and ultimately killing unanimously passed state bill.
And this brings us to what the researchers term the realpolitik countercurrent. We are basically looking at two parallel realities playing out globally that seem completely, totally contradictory. Over on the accountability track, you have actual guilty pleas in Manhattan for murder for hire, you have Canadian expulsions of top diplomats, and you have massive official public inquiries. But running at the exact same time on the diplomatic track, you have thawing bilateral relations, ongoing and lucrative trade agreement negotiations, and continued deep defense partnerships between India and the West. Our source makes a really distinct, almost chilling observation here. A state can apparently absorb a guilty plea for a transnational assassination plot, alongside multi-year escalations of administrative exile against journalists and academics, and still continue entirely normal, thriving economic and diplomatic relations with the very countries whose laws were explicitly broken.
So what does all this actually mean for the person on the ground? It creates what the source calls the multiplication effect. Think about the impossible arithmetic we discussed earlier. Now, an activist living in the West isn't just worried about foreign intelligence agents tracking them or their family safety back abroad. They simultaneously have to navigate narrative containment from well-funded, highly organized domestic advocacy groups right in their own host country, groups that are entirely ready to label their civil rights work as extremism. It's not just a double burden. It literally multiplies the chilling effect. You face severe kinetic pressure from the state you fled and intense narrative pressure from within the very democracy you sought refuge in.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with this final quote from the source material because I think it captures the whole thing perfectly. A life, a voice, or a document of belonging can be made to disappear through a process designed never to leave a signature explaining why. Ultimately, this is the grand achievement of the architecture of deniability we've explored today. Whether it is a suddenly frozen bank account, a permanently canceled OCI card, a vetoed civil rights bill, or a bullet in a suburban parking lot, the system functions seamlessly to silence dissent without ever formally, officially taking the blame.
Which leaves us with a pretty massive, crucial question to ponder. When geopolitical interests like global trade, defense pacts, and diplomacy proceed completely uninterrupted, despite proven coercion happening on democratic soil, what is the ultimate price a global citizen must pay for their dissent? If Western democracies won't let these proven actions actually derail their diplomatic alliances, how safe is any critic anywhere in the world? Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer. Keep asking the tough questions and keep looking closely at the world around you. Catch you next time.